Welcome to this final session of the conference, and I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing Dr. Tony Goldstone, who will already be well known to many members of the audience. He's a consultant radiologist and the National Clinician Advisor on Pay and Pensions at the BMA, as well as Deputy Chair of the BMA Pensions Committee. He's very kindly agreed to join us today to share some of his extensive expertise and knowledge of pensions. I'm sure this will generate plenty of questions and discussion, for which there'll be time after the talk, but please do upload any questions to Slido during the course of the session. Tony, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for welcoming me back, because I was here 3 years ago at the same meeting, and it was a busy meeting then. So I'm Tony Goldstone. I'm a radiologist up in East Yorkshire, and I've somehow found myself as one of the national experts on pensions. So if we just start off with kind of what is a pension, because this is really important, and a pension is a really important part of our total reward. So if we think of our total reward, and you'll see this on your total reward statement, you see you've obviously got your pay component, and then you've also got a pension. And a pension is essentially pay, but it's not pay during your working life, it's pay in your retirement. And you'll all be aware with what's going on with the juniors and lots of other public sector workers at the moment, our pay has really not kept up with inflation. So for most people in this room who will be or will become consultants, typically you would end up at top of the consultant pay scale on an average local CA4 with 3% on call. Back in 2008, that was £114,000. And had that kept up with RPI inflation, that would now be £178,000. And the reason why this is relevant is because we're all on a defined benefit pension, it's related to that salary. So any pay cut that we've endured over the last 12 or so years is also a pension cut. And that's even before we start talking about pension taxation. So really important to remember that graph, and I'll come back to that at the end. So, as I said, we're all in a defined benefit scheme, and anyone that's paying into the pension today in 2022 and 2023 is in more than one scheme. So everyone is in this scheme on the right, the 2015 scheme, which is called a Career Average Revalued Earnings Scheme. And what that means is, rather than being related to your final salary, they take your salary each year, they divide it by 54, and then that goes into a theoretical pot. And then each year that pot is increased by inflation plus 1.5%, and that process is called revaluation, rather than the old scheme that was based on your final salary. And anyone that was in the scheme prior to that will have either a 1995 pension, or if you started after 2008, or if you chose to move into the 2008 scheme, you'll be in the 2008 scheme. And they're slightly different. The 1995 scheme is based on 80ths, okay? And the idea was is if you did a full 40-year career in the NHS, you would get 40 80ths, or a half pension, and then that became your pension. And part of that scheme as well, you would also get a lump sum of 3 times that pension value. The 08 scheme has a higher normal retirement age, so instead of it being 60, it's 65 versus state pension age in the current scheme, but there's no lump sum. So essentially you're offsetting that later retirement age by a higher accrual. And there's other subtle differences. I'll just talk about some of the differences between them. In all of them, the normal retirement age isn't the only age that you can go at. You can go at minimum retirement age in any of the schemes. But if you do so, you'll take what's called an actuarial reduction. And that's not intended to be punitive. It just means that if you go earlier, because you'll be drawing your pension for longer, they take a reduction. And that's typically in the range of about 4 to 5% per year. Now, in the 2 newer schemes, we also have so-called late retirement factors. And that means that if you do go after your normal retirement age, quite rightly, because you'll be drawing it for less, you will get an increase in your pension. One of the anomalies of the 1995 scheme is that there's no late retirement factors. And that means that if you work after 60, you are just literally burning pension. You've paid for that pension, but you won't get it. That's going to be slightly changed with something called partial retirement, which I'll come on to. And there's other small differences with adult and child dependents, and there's different tax nuances for all of those as well, which I'm not going to go into today, but there's plenty of videos on the BMA Pensions website. Okay, so moving on to taxation. So in the old days, before all of this malarkey, people were paying either 5 or 6% into their 1995 pension, and they didn't have to contend with pension taxation. And the government decided that we were all living too long and that was all very expensive, and they wanted to limit the amount of tax relief for pensions, and they did that by introducing 2 taxes. Okay, and the first of those taxes is called the lifetime allowance. And if you think of the lifetime allowance as a jug, and it started off at £1.5 million, it's increased up to £1.8 million in 11-12, and then it gradually was cut down to its current level of £1.07 million. Now, of course, we're not putting into a pot as such, like a normal private pension, because we have a defined benefit pension. And so to turn the value into one that you test against the lifetime allowance, they times it by 20 on the date of your retirement, and then they add in the lump sum. So for a 1995 pension, it's 23 times your 1995 pension. And that produces a value. And you can still exceed that value, so the water can kind of flow over the jug, if you like, but then that's taxed quite heavily. So 25% tax rate if it comes from your pension, and that's because your pension is obviously subject to income tax when your pension is in payment, or if you choose to take it as a lump sum, which is currently tax-free, that's not taxed, and then at the higher rate of 55%. Now, most doctors will hit, inverted commas, LTA in late 40s or mid-50s, early mid-50s. And it used to be very easy when we were in one pension scheme to do the sum and just do 23 times pension, and you know when your pot is full. It's now more nuanced because we've all got 2015 pension. And in the 2015 pension, because it's linked to state pension age, assuming most of you don't really want to work until you're 67 or 68, you'll be taking actuarial reduction, and your pot is measured at the point you take your pension. So if there's a reduction in there for going early, that's the point that they measure the LTA. So it's a bit more difficult to calculate. Really important not to assume automatically that it's not worth staying in the pension once you've hit the LTA. You will get less money for sure because it's taxed, it's a high rate, but you still need to do the sums and work out whether or not it's worth it for you. And part of those sums will depend on whether or not you're affected by both the AA and the LTA. If you are affected by the AA and the LTA, that seriously reduces the value of that pension, and it might not be worth it anymore. It will also be really important what you get back by coming out of the scheme. So some trusts offer recycling, all GP partners can access recycling, but many trusts around the UK don't. And that may tip the balance of whether or not it's worth it or not. You should also think about what rate of tax will you be paying on your pension. So if you're busting a gut above the LTA to get a bigger pension, but that makes you a high rate taxpayer, that's all needs thinking about as well, into what you're putting in and what you're going to get out. So the lifetime allowance used to keep up with inflation, and a certain Boris Johnson, when he was running for PM in 29, said that he knew it was a problem and he was going to sort out the cap because he knew it was making doctors retire. But far from getting rid of or increasing the lifetime allowance, the following year, Rishi Sunak decided to freeze it. And so this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So although it's frozen at £1.07 million, all £1.07 million jugs are not the same because of fiscal drag. So one of the features of current economic policy around income tax and the LTA is that all the levels are frozen. So that means that when it was frozen at 1.07 in 21, by the end of the freeze, if it's unfrozen at all, in 2026, that will only be worth £818,000 in real terms. So if you think I need X amount of pension to be able to comfortably retire and pay for whatever lifestyle that you want, you need to bear that in mind. Just because it's staying at £1.07 billion, prices aren't. So one would have thought that if you are wanting to limit tax relief and you've done that via the LTA, there is no need to also have an annual allowance. And it's crazy to have both, but we do. And so the annual allowance is how much you can fill that pot each year, okay? So when this was introduced, it was at a level, or went up to a level of £255,000. And at that level, no public sector workers practically were ever affected by the annual allowance. But that was whittled down to 50 and then to £40,000. And then some bright spark decided to introduce the horrible tapered annual allowance. And then potentially that came down as little as £10,000. And then following a lot of campaigning by the BMA and others, that was changed in the March 20 budget so that the levels you could earn before that was triggered went up by £90,000 from £110,000 to £200,000. But conversely, the minimum tapering was down to £4,000. So basically, if you want to fill your jug in a tax-efficient manner, you have to do it without exceeding the volume of these things. And so if you're a very high earner and have only got a fully tapered AA of £4,000, it's clearly impossible to fill a 1 litre jug with 4 mils every year without paying an enormous amount of tax. And everyone, in terms of certainly full-time consultants, senior SAS doctors and GPs, will exceed the AA, the general AA, at some point. So moving on to what else has kind of changed over the last 24 months or so since I last came and talked to you guys at the Association of Anaesthetists meeting. So I'm going to go through these 5 main areas. So we've talked a little bit already about the March 21 budget. I'm going to talk about the so-called McLeod judgment. We'll all be aware of high inflation at the moment and some of the issues around high inflation, and then a little bit about partial retirement, and then a little bit about recycling, or something called PILOP. So, as I said, contrary to Boris Johnson saying that they were going to sort something out with the LTA, it was leaked that they, rather than increasing it or getting rid of it altogether, they were going to freeze it in the March 21 budget. And at the time, we in the BMA put out a survey to 8,000 or so GPs and consultants and said that the freeze would make the vast majority of them retire earlier and or reduce their hours, 72% and 61% respectively. But despite that, government pressed ahead and they froze it. And bear in mind, these figures were when inflation was then running at 0.5%, with a long-term prediction of inflation of 2%. But even at those levels of inflation, that would cost a typical 43-year-old then between around £187,000 and £300,000 worth of value of their pension. So it sounds like quite a benign thing to do, just to freeze the level, but they make a massive impact on the value of your pension. And also, bearing in mind lots of people were retiring earlier, you can see how these graphs diverge, so that there was no difference once you're below the LTA, so they stopped to hit it around 55, but then once they're above it, the effect of freezing means that that pension is reduced significantly. And we told government, you know, just look at the evidence that you have already. So if we look at the blue line, that shows the percentage reduction in the lifetime allowance. So you can see here there's a nice flat bit where the LTA was flat in real terms because it was linked to inflation, but the graph really closely correlates with the number of early retirements. And this is for GPs. There's a similar graph for consultants, which is not quite as steep, but still very closely correlated. And the main difference is that the GPs, because they're all business owners, all get annual advice from their accountants. And so they realise the pinch point of when it comes. So moving on to MacLeod. So MacLeod was a judge, and she was a young judge, and she saw the 2015 pensions come in and that her older judge colleagues were going to get some form of protection, in that they could keep their old style pension or would get tapered protection. And she felt that was unfair and took the government to court and won. And that led to the MacLeod judgments, and the firefighters did the same. So what does this mean? So in a nutshell, it means that everyone before 2015, if you were in the NHS, was in their old scheme, their legacy scheme, so the 95 or the 08 scheme. Everyone after 2022 is in the new reformed scheme, and the MacLeod judgment is only about the bit in the middle. So it's about this 7-year remedy period. So basically, when you retire, you will get to choose whether this 7-year period only is in the old scheme or the new scheme, and more about that later. So there's two major impacts to that. One is going to be around annual allowance tax, because the tax charges will look very different in the old scheme than they were being in both schemes. So this is Consultant A, and all the BMA DDRB submissions have featured this Consultant A, who back then was a 40-year-old on a CA4, 12 PAs with 50k of NHS earnings. And you can see over the 7-year remedy period, they'd have charges of £22,000, or rather £27,000 of AA charges, some of which were settled with the AA compensation scheme because they were in England and Wales. Once everything is MacLeoded and put back into the old legacy scheme for those 7 years, this consultant's AA charges will get down to £4,000. So they will be expecting a refund depending on whether or not they were in the compensation scheme of between £17,000 and £23,000. And we're expecting that to happen in October 2024. But the maths behind of this is all quite complicated, because apart from anything else, the tax rules have changed 4 times, even during that 7-year period. So we've got a bit that was before tapering, we've got the original taper, we've got the England and Wales compensation scheme, and then we've got the new tapered annual allowance with the new threshold and adjusted incomes. So that's going to be complicated, and it's going to take some work to do, and that will either be done by your accountant, or HMRC are looking at setting up an HMRC-led compensation scheme where hopefully they will get most of the data automatically, because obviously they know from self-assessment what your earnings are. They'll get some information from the scheme. There's a bit of a question around how accurate some of that information from the scheme is, and lots of you may have already had issues with accuracy of scheme-provided information, but hopefully that will allow HMRC to direct the changes themselves to self-assessment forms without having to resubmit 7 years of data and or sort out scheme pays elections. And all of that is a bit up in the air at the moment, what the extent of what government are going to do, because if they don't do it and you've got to go to your accountant, then the government will likely be liable for those accountancy fees to sort out that particular element, because it was all due to their age discrimination. So then comes phase 2, which only happens at your retirement. So when you come to retire, the scheme will provide you with some information to try and help you decide whether or not you want that 7-year period in the middle in the old scheme or the new scheme. And one of the bit that we've been working very hard in the background and doing lots of lobbying around has been around what happens to pension taxation if you choose the reformed benefits. You remember that Consultant A had a refund of, £18,000 odd. So obviously if they choose the reformed scheme later on, there's potentially going to be some AA charges. But as per the original consultation, and as confirmed in the consultation that closed last Friday, just gone, so I'll just read it out, where the difference between the opening value and the closing value based on the new benefits is more than the difference between based on the old benefits, your AA charge will be based on the old benefits. So essentially that means that if you choose the 2015 bit for that 7-year period on retirement, you won't get a bigger AA charge than you would have had you chosen the legacy scheme benefits. All of that has been complicated further by some other documents that were released the day before Christmas around partial retirement, and potentially there's going to be a complicated interaction with partial retirement rules that might undo that if you then come back to work after partial retirement. So we're doing lots of work in the background with Treasury and the Department of Health and HMRC and NHS England just to try and get them to fix that, because clearly if people are going to get a big tax charge by going back to work, no one's going to go back to work, and that's not in their best interest, so they're trying to fix it. Now, lots of you might automatically assume, incorrectly, that you will be better choosing the old legacy benefits, but actually, for several reasons, most people will actually be better off with new reformed benefits. And that's for a number of reasons. Principally, we've had very high inflation just after the legacy period, with 10.1% this year and likely 7.9% next year. And the 2015 scheme automatically comes with some inflation protection built into it. But then you'll also be aware that our pay is being destroyed at the moment by the government. And so if your final salary benefits are related to your final salary pay and that pay goes down, then you'll be better with reform benefits. But there'll be other things that come into it as well, such as lump sum. 2015 doesn't come with an automatic lump sum. How much you want or need tax-free cash via a tax-free lump sum, how much you want or need spouse or dependent benefits. So it'll be a complicated decision that people will need help navigating. So because of high inflation, another feature, unfortunately, for patients and the waiting list is that for lots of people, because of the sub-inflationary pay awards, which means a big drop in your pension, it meant that they were running towards the door this year because inflation is off the scale. And that's because of the disconnect between the pay award, which was a maximum of 4.5% excluding CEA, so typically between 1% and 4% for most consultants, and inflation. And so basically by people, if they were peri-retirement age and they were staying on at work, they would bake that big pay cut into it, and they could end up with a lower pension. Unfortunately for next year, the same thing might happen. The Bank of England are predicting inflation between 7.7 and 7.9%. Treasury said on New Year's Day that they want pay capped at 2%. That will exclude CAs again. So again, we're talking about a 6 or 7% pay cut, which will mean people will head towards the door. But we do have the promise, or at least a consultation, of partial retirements. That means that people might be able to lock in their 1995 benefits and therefore not have that problem and continue to go on in the 2015 scheme. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So you need to look at your numbers really carefully and time retirement, if you're fortunate enough to be around retirement age, really carefully. And there's lots of conflicting information out there. So recently the government put this on their website trying to show, you can bust through the LTA without a problem. And if you retire at 59 without breaching the LTA, you get a pension of 44. If you bust through the LTA and instead stay on and work till 60, you get a pension of 48. And that's almost £4,000 a year more for your entire life. But unfortunately, they'd calculated it incorrectly and they'd missed the inflation out. So actually, if you recalculated it by staying on a year, their pension was £500 a year later, and they had an £18,000 a year annual allowance charge, and they'd carried on paying 14.5% into their pension. So there's information, there's perhaps some misinformation or misunderstanding out there as well. So if you're considering retirement, do your sums and get advice if needed. To try and help people navigate that for last tax year, we did a modeler. And of course, there's other options. It's not just, retire or carry on. There's also retire and return. So we did this tool to try and help people navigate that mess with very high inflation. And we're hoping that there will be a partial retirement option from April 23, although we're hearing some rumblings that might not be the case and it might be later in the year. And our message to government has been very clear that if it's not guaranteed by April 23, we will have to do a similar tool for next year, because it will be better, unfortunately, for some people to again retire or retire and return rather than do partial retirement if it takes 6 months or so for that to come. And clearly, given the catastrophe that's going on in the NHS at the moment. That's not in anyone's interest, so we hope government will pull their finger out and deliver this by April 23 as originally promised. So CPI disconnect. So the annual allowance is a complicated beast, and one of the complications is that there are two different values used for inflation. So you're allowed to increase your pension by last year's inflation, but your pension in the 2015 scheme increases by this year's inflation plus 1.5%. So if inflation is flat and bubbling along at 2%, that isn't an issue because there's no disconnect between last year and this year. But we've all seen the graphs of what's happened to inflation because of the terrible things going on in Ukraine and other factors. And that's led to a disconnect which would have caused just catastrophically bad problems, particularly for GPs, because all of their previous pension was also in the care scheme. So government are currently consulting on a solution to that. It's not the solution that I wanted, but it is a solution for the 2015 pension, and it will fix the problem pretty well for GPs. But it will also make things very complicated. And so we would very much like them to do this properly by fixing the Finance Act, and Scottish governments have said the same thing to Westminster as well. So a much bigger issue, and particularly for people sat in this room, because we're employed and not GPs, is the other thing that's related to inflation, and that is something called negative growth. And this is something that we all need to understand and be very angry about. So in the current consultation that's open, which closes later this month, government would like you to believe that by aligning the values means that the annual allowance only measures pension growth above inflation. But unfortunately, that is just simply not true, because we're still left with the inflation-related issue of something called negative growth. So as I said, because of high inflation and pay lagging behind inflation, our 1995 pensions, which will be the most part for lots of people, will have massive negative growth. And so, for example, here, this graph at the bottom right, we've modelled a typical mid-career consultant still with 2 increments to go on 10 PAs, no additional income at all. And because of ignoring negative PIAs, they will overpay annual allowance tax charges of £48,000 from their post-tax income, which is clearly scandalous. And it's all because of this one word in section 234 of the Finance Act, in that they only recognise an increase for growth, which means they zero off a negative amount. And all of you will have huge negative amounts in your 1995 pension for 23-24 and for 24-25. And so that will mean that you will continue to pay massive charges for annual allowance on your 2015 pensions, despite the fact your overall pension is probably going to go down because of the negative growth from 95. And that's clearly scandalous. I think it is tantamount to theft, and lots of stuff is going on in the background to try and get them to correct that. So partial retirement is another thing that's being consulted on at the moment. It's broadly welcomed. I've been lobbying it for several years with colleagues in the BMA, alongside late retirement factors, which we've still not got. But essentially what this means is that if it comes in, you'll be able to take your 1995 pension without a break in your employment contract. And that's important because that means you'll still get your annual leave entitlement, potentially still keep on to pensionable CEAs. We don't have all the detail at the moment on this, and so I will reserve judgment on it until we've seen the final detail on it, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. 2 elements that are frankly stupid that are in the current consultation is one, a requirement for a 10% reduction in pensionable pay, because clearly 7 million people on a waiting list is not enough, so government want you to potentially work less. It's just stupid. And there's another element called abatement, which means that should you go over that 90% level, you will pound for pound give back that from your pension. Again, just completely crazy given what's going on in the NHS. They should make it unlimited. As I said before, incredibly important that they get this launched and ready to go by April 2023. That's because we're expecting very high inflation again next year, 7.9%. And so if it's 6 months late, for example, then lots of people will have been better off by just traditional retire and return or retirement than partial retirement, because they will have baked that pay cut into next year's pay, which is clearly crazy. So we very much hope that government listen to us and get their act together and sort it out, or put some interval solution in before it comes in if they don't have the admin systems to do it. So bringing you right up to date, so this was on Wednesday. There was a further debate in the House of Lords about pension taxation, and as I said, the big kid on the block at the moment is negative growth. So Lord Davis, who's actually a pensions actuary and is a Labour Lord, said that it was really important that I'll just read it. We have a real problem for getting the NHS back on track. We need to retain senior staff, and unless the government succeed, particularly on the need to have an effective and efficient system for dealing with the index mismatch, that's the CPI disconnect, especially taking into account negative pension growth, we will continue to have those difficulties. And also support on the other side of the House. So Baroness Altman was a previous pensions minister, so again she's a pensions expert, and she said, again, if we're able to change sections 234 and 235 of the Finance Act to better allow total pension calculations to cruise above inflation, that would at least address some of these issues, and lots of other issues around the craziness of the interest rates for scheme pays, which I've not touched on today, and other matters were discussed. But all of this is being hotly debated, and there is support, on all sides of the House in both chambers to try and do something about this mess. So the minister who responded to that on Wednesday evening was Lord Markham, and he's the Conservative Minister of the Department of Health. And unfortunately, he just completely ignored the negative pension growth issue, didn't even mention it in his response, despite it being one of the main issues that was raised. But what he did raise was what government clearly see as the solution, and that's something called PILOP, or pension in lieu of pay. So I'll just read you what he said. What we're trying to do in all of this, and we're not there yet, is to get a situation where if it is penal for someone to receive this as part of their pension, they can receive it as part of their pay instead, at which point they'll be paying tax at their marginal rate. And then looking forward, offering flexibility and choice. And lots of you will kind of recognise some of this because it's actually been consulted on twice before, most recently in 2019 when government were proposing flexible accrual, and government themselves rejected it. Because in their opening bit of their conclusion, it said the majority of consultation responses argued that tax reform would be the simplest way of solving the issue of senior clinicians limiting their NHS work for fear of large unexpected annual allowance charges. But despite them trying to push for this twice before, they clearly still think this is the answer. So what do we in the BMA think the fixes are? So most importantly is to fix this issue for this tax year of CPI disconnect, so that it's only measuring growth that's really above inflation. That will be most elegantly done in the Finance Act via a very small amendment. The Scottish Government, like the BMA and others, have also asked for this solution rather than moving the revaluation date, which makes it very messy and very difficult for people to work out what their pension growth is going to be for this year as well as for next year. There's this big issue which affects everyone in this room of negative pension growth, and it's really important they address this issue of only measuring an increase in your pension. So as I said, a typical mid-career consultant, 10 PAs, no private practice, is going to lose £50,000 over the next 10 years of their post-tax income if they don't fix this issue of negative pension growth. And it's also about fixing it because that's the right and fair thing to do. It's completely disgraceful that they're wanting to charge people for non-existent growth that's not above inflation at all, because they've got their eyes closed to one part of our pension going down. It's scandalous. Another option for them to consider, given the current NHS pressures, is to do something like they did in 1920. So If you listen to government press releases at the moment, you might be under the impression that all the backlogs are due to COVID and nothing else. But those of you that were in the NHS in 2019 might remember that government was scrambling to try and do something about this problem, and therefore they introduced the compensation scheme when the waiting list was at the point where that blue arrow is. So given that the graph has continued to go up along that same trajectory, definitely worsened by COVID, it might be appropriate for the government to do something about it. And you might have heard of this chap called Jeremy Hunt, who was the chair of the Health Select Committee, who in August said, grant an immediate exemption to doctors to public sector pension rules, which are currently forcing them to retire in their 50s in alarming numbers, and made a similar comment in September the 30th of this year, just before he came Chancellor. So all eyes on Jeremy Hunt to fix the problem. There are some other important issues, and I know it's quite difficult to keep up with who the Health Secretary is on a week-by-week basis, but we had one called Theresa Coffey on the 22nd of September, and although she slightly changed what she said depending on which day of the week it was, she invariably said that they would expect or strongly encourage trusts to offer recycling. And Jeremy Hunt, when he was chair of Health Select Committee, used the word mandated, and the BMA view very much is that it should be mandated the full amount of the pension contribution, so the 20.6% less employers NI, and that should be centralised. At the moment, we've got a bit of a joke of a postcode lottery, you know, certainly in England, on whether or not trusts are offering it, although government in Wales and Scotland appear to be getting their house in slightly more order in rolling this out more widely. So my preferred solution and the BMA's preferred solution, what we've been talking to government about for a while now, is doing something that they've already done for another sector where they had very similar problems, and that was with the judiciary. And judges also found themselves hit with AA charges every year and being over the lifetime allowance, and that was a potent disincentive to carry on working. And so for judges in 2021, so post-COVID, so when the government knew the economic position that they were in, they changed their 2015 scheme, their reform scheme, to a tax and registered scheme. And what a tax and registered schemes mean is that you don't get tax relief on your contributions on the way in, but because of that, you don't measure your pension against either the annual or lifetime allowance. So from our perspective, given the mess that is the NHS at the moment, it would be a fire and forget solution. People wouldn't be, you know, scrambling to do calculations every October. They wouldn't be worrying about how many sessions they've got to work to not trip over into the AA. They wouldn't be worrying about whether additional sessions are going to cause tapering issues, etc., etc. We can just all get back to doing the job that we were trained to do, and the job that patients very much need us to do, given the state of what's going on in the NHS. And so we hope that government will listen to us, but Lord Markham on Wednesday evening did comment on it, saying that he didn't think it was the right solution. We politely disagree. So will things change? I get asked this question on an almost daily basis. You know, there's a huge amount of work going on in the background with the BMA. There's a load of legal cases. We're in the High Court later this month about something called the cost cap, which I've not even talked about today. There's lots going on in Parliament. There was an excellent debate by Conservative MP Dan Poulter in July on the Finance Act and negative growth issue in tax unregistered. Liz Truss, of course, promised that she would sort the problems of doctors' pensions out, but she wasn't around for very long. Jeremy Hunt, who's now Chancellor, in August and September said that he would sort out the problem. I think most people think there's probably going to be a change of government when there's a general election, and the Shadow Health Secretary has said that he would scrap the cap, but we're not entirely clear what cap it is he's talking about, but I'm meeting him later this month, so hopefully we can clarify. And as I said, Lord Brixton, who's a pensions actuary, knows a thing or two about pensions, has had his second debate in the last 3 months on annual allowance issues, the first on 13th September and the second only 2 days ago. So, as I said, there's this thing that's potentially going to be offered called PILOP. And there's a chap called John Ralph, who's a pensions consultant, whatever one of those is, who seems to think it's a good idea, and he wrote and got a letter published in the Times yesterday saying, you know, let's just all solve the strikes of everyone in the workforce by getting them to give up a year's pension, and then we can give them a lump sum instead. And what I would say to you is you need to kind of come back to this graph and look at what's happened to our pay, because our pay has been destroyed by sub-inflationary pay awards, and our pension has been destroyed because our pension is related to that pay that's been destroyed, and that's even before the destruction that's come from the annual and the lifetime allowances. So I would say to this solution of, you know, asking Peter to pay Paul is not a good one, because we are Peter and Paul. You can't just rob from our pensions to increase our pay, because that's taking something already out of our reward package to top up our pay. What we need to do is fix our pay, and we need to fix the problems with pension taxation. The pension scheme itself is a good scheme, but it's being ruined, unfortunately, by pension taxation. So I've talked about quite a lot, so just a quick summary slide, and then we've got a bit of time for questions. So pensions are complicated. There's a lot of excellent work, and I've got some excellent colleagues in the BMA and some excellent staff colleagues supporting me, both on the legal side and actuarial side and elsewhere. But it's very individual, and people need to understand all of this stuff because it's difficult. And it's well worth spending a bit of time educating yourself on it and using the various tools out there. I've done several modelers. Some people will need financial advice because it's complicated, and it's difficult finding advisors who are themselves competent and fully understand all of this. So just very quickly going through some of the changes. So the taper changed in March 20, so now that's only an issue if you earn over £200,000. The LTA is frozen. That's a big deal now because inflation is very high, which means the LTA in real terms is dropping like a stone. McLeod, you just need to split into these two bits. There's going to be a bit in October 24 where if you've had any AA charges previously, you will have to access this compensation scheme to get those repaid or to correct your scheme pays. Elections, and then the decision will be at retirement whether or not you want to take either or, and I strongly suspect that for most people not retired already or retiring in the next few months, that choice will almost always be the 2015 scheme. High inflation is unfortunately driving lots of bad things. It's pushing this doesn't pay to stay agenda. We hope that partial retirement will come, and we hope it will come by April, because if it doesn't, then unfortunately people may be in that position again. So we would strongly encourage government to listen and make sure that is in place by April, or some interim solution if it's not. The CPI disconnect issue is mostly solved by moving the revaluation dates. It's not the most elegant way of doing it. It's going to make things very difficult to compute, but that's what government want to do. But the big issue, and as I said, for a typical consultant sat out there in that audience, it might be worth £50,000 or so for you over the next 10 years. So it's a big issue, it needs fixing, and people need to be angry about it. Solutions for me are fix the Finance Act, do this properly, including a fix for this issue of negative PIAs, and do what you've done for the judiciary. Let's put a tax and registered scheme in so we can all get back to doctoring and not worrying about our pensions or pension taxation. And another solution would be full mandated recycling. So thank you very much, everybody. I tweet quite regularly about this stuff on Twitter, so if you scan that QR code, feel free to follow me on Twitter, and I will open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that highly informative, if slightly, well, very depressing subject matter. I'm going to open up the session to the floor. If you have any questions, please do use the microphones that are in the audience so that we can all hear the questions. As anticipated, loads coming in on Slido. So if I perhaps start with a couple of the Slido questions, and then anyone wanting to add anything from the audience, please do. So I think, considering, you know, as you said, it's a very complex subject matter. We do need to try and educate ourselves as best we can. Where can we get reasonable pension advice at a reasonable cost?
Yeah, it's challenging, and it's expensive. And you know, if for example the government bring in PILOP, which it looks like they're certainly indicating that they want to do, that will unfortunately potentially push people into a position where they need advice every year. You know, to calculate, you know, is it worth staying in the scheme? Do I want to come out of the scheme? If I want to stay in the scheme, how much do I want to be in the scheme? And that will be costly. And that's one of the many reasons we think it's not the right solution, and we would much rather they move to a tax and rented scheme where we could all forget about the need to get financial advice. But the BMA are obviously affiliated with their own financial advisors. I would always encourage people to ask their colleagues locally if they've had, you know, good advice from somebody locally that they can pick the phone up to.
Thank you. Another question from Slido. So when you discuss with government, who do you actually discuss with, and who is it who's moving the levers?
So that's a really good question, because there's a lot of interdepartmental blame shift going on in government, and there's also a lot of, oh, you know, this is all a mistake and unintended consequences. So Matt Hancock 3 years ago stood up in Parliament and said, you know, this is a car crash, but it's unintended consequences. And, you know, as time goes on and we're still here talking about similar things, it becomes the point where we've got to say, well, look, if it's unintended consequences, can you fix it, please? Because there's 7 million people on a waiting list, and people that want to stay in work and want to work, you know, more sessions. So please fix it. So in terms of who holds the levers, well, Steve Barclay, our Secretary of State, was asked to fix this in the House of Parliament this week, and he said it's up to Treasury to deliver this. And, you know, at least we are gifted with somebody who we know understands the problem. You know, Jeremy Hunt was obviously a former health secretary. He was also chair of Health Select Committee. As part of that, they brought out a really good report at the latter end of 2022 on, you know, retaining people. And he absolutely acknowledged that one of their key findings was the need to sort out the issues with pension taxation. And now he's the man that can do it, because he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So our discussions are with Departments of Health and Treasury officials, and of course employee representatives, so NHS England and NHS employees, and I think they all have a role to try and work together, but ultimately this has all got to be signed off and sanctioned by Treasury.
Thank you. So another Slido. Apart from feeling aggrieved, what else can we do to get the government to reform the pension charges?
So, you know, one thing that I've been advocating for the 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this stuff is speak to your MP. You know, your MP is paid to represent you, and your MP will be worried about being re-elected come the next general election, particularly given the fact that Labour have indicated that they want to sort this problem out as well. So write to your MP, go and meet your MP in their surgery, let them know how it's affecting you, and ask them to knock on the Chancellor's door and do something about it. And most of the time we've seen colleagues stand up and ask about this. It's been on the back of you know, members' stories saying, you know, I'm 50X, I'm being forced into this position of reducing my hours or retiring. I don't want to do it. I've got many more years to give, but I can't do it at these rates of taxation. So let them know your story, and you're much better writing individually and telling them your own story than just doing a, you know, carbon copy letter. But obviously we put out tools, we do write to your MP tools regularly. Please do those as well. But yeah, in terms of what can you do, that probably is the single most important thing you can do is lobby the people that represent you for change.
Thank you.
Do you want me to pick a couple up from here?
Yes, but I think we've got a question from the audience now.
Okay, so the question was about people who've lost added years contract. So if you give up an added year contract, you've got 1 year to come back to it, and then you can pick it up automatically. If it's been greater than a year, there is no direct mechanism for getting it back. The only caveat to that is one of the things that is in the McLeod judgment is something called contingent decisions, which I've not discussed today because it's complicated. But basically, if you came out of added years because of the age discrimination in the 2015 scheme and high taxation, you will be allowed to make a case to government using a scheme that's not been announced yet to try and get that back and put yourself back in the position you were before the discrimination happened. The BMA's approach to this was that it's ridiculous to do it on a case-by-case basis, and you should have a list of, things that will be automatic. So people that reduced hours or stopped added year contracts, or stopped contributing towards the scheme in total because of taxation, because of the discrimination, should automatically be able to reverse that decision. But government pressed ahead and they want to do it on a case-by-case basis, but we don't yet know what the evidential requirements will be for that to prove that you took that decision because of discrimination. So if it was less than a year, you can go back in.
But when I wrote to withdraw from the scheme, I made it very clear in writing then, so that's the only proof I can provide.
Yeah. Well, no, they've still not told us what the mechanism will be for contingent decisions. And, every time we get a timetable, the timetable slips, so that, all that McLeod compensation was all meant to be delivered by October 2023. In the last month or so, they've put that back a year to October 2024. The reason why BSA is saying that they can't deliver partial retirement by April 23 is McLeod. And so, that's the other reason for tax unregistered, is that, everyone is completely swamped by all of this mess that's been created by this taxation of being, because of the McLeod remedy. If we move to a tax unregistered scheme, all of this ridiculous admin requirements related to pension taxation would go away. I'll just pick up another couple of questions from Slido. So Deepak asks, is scheme pays advisable if you get a bill? That's a difficult one. So scheme pays has a really high interest rate, so it's inflation plus 2.4%. So currently, with inflation at 10.1%, that makes the interest rate for scheme pays 12.5%. So I say to people, there's a number of things to weigh up. One, can you afford to pay it? So if you can't afford to pay it, then that's answered your question. Two is, how far away from retirement are you? If you're within a couple of years from retirement, there'll be relatively little interest. So it's probably, not such a bad thing to use scheme pays. If you're in your 30s or 40s and you're 20 years away from retirement, then the interest will be considerable. Another consideration is whether or not you will be over the lifetime allowance when you retire. So if you are, because the scheme pays deduction comes off before you work out the capital value of your pension, it becomes a very tax efficient way of paying the charge. So it's not an easy yes or no. It depends on your factors and what else you would do with that money if you didn't pay the bill. And it's something that you probably need to take advice about if it's not obvious to you what to do. A question, do we have a government who are seeking to drive doctors to work in the private sector rather than the NHS? And I think that's an entirely reasonable question given everything that's going on. And the answer is I don't know, and I hope not. But they can't continue to hide behind unintended consequences anymore. Everyone can see, and the electorate can see what's happening to the NHS. And I think it will very much determine what happens at the next general election. So if they want to dismantle the NHS, pension taxation is a very good way of doing it, and it's working. But if they want to save the NHS and win the next general election, maybe it's time to pull their finger out and do something better than they've done already. If you breach the AA once, you are likely to breach every year. Is that consistently true? does it make sense to sign up for scheme pays for every year of the AA tax charge? So unfortunately, so if we go back to, I'm not presenting this anymore, that graph that showed the tax charges, they do generally just go up every year in a care scheme. So unless it was for a one-off reason, like a pay increments, for example, and then you drop out of taxation for a bit, then you might be okay. But generally, once your carry forward is gone and you hit by charges, they will come every year and they will get bigger every year, unfortunately. And so that makes scheme pays prohibitively expensive, and that's why lots of people, particularly those that are accessing advice, will end up reducing their sessions so that they start to fall below the level at which they hit taxation. But that's not a great thing for 7 million people on a waiting list.
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
We've had some discussions in our trust recently about the possibility of going on to a 9+2 or 9+3 type job plan, with the nine being pensionable and then the added non-pensionable sessions. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you've had discussions about or experience of as a possible solution.
Yeah, so that is one way of doing it. So the most important bit to that is, will you get your employee's contribution back on the bit that is non-pensionable? Because if you're not, that is just a pay cut. Mm-hmm. So it's exactly the same dilemma that that we have with pile-up as a solution. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. So a really important part of your remuneration package is the pension and the pay element. So if you're giving up any bit of pension, you need to make sure at the very least you're getting back the employee's contribution. And it's also just incredibly complicated for you to work out where you need to be, for your trust to administer. It's not the right solution, and we were very clear with employees that that wasn't something that we thought was a good idea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yes, there's a question here.
Surely I won't be able to sort that out until I decide when I retire whether I want to do that or not.
Okay, so that comes back to that. I don't know if I can go back to the slides or not. So that's what the HMRC compensation scheme will be. So the first stage of McLeod is for government to undo the discrimination. And to undo the discrimination, they have to put everybody back. So I'll present this slide. They have to, the first bit of it is for them to correct the discrimination, and they correct the discrimination by automatically putting you back into the legacy scheme. So everyone, even people that transitioned over like you and I, will automatically be put back into the 1995 scheme. For all of us, because none of us are MHO psychiatrists, if you had a charge, that charge will almost certainly be lower, because it's lower in the 1995 scheme, because you've not got the issue of being in two schemes and negative PIAs, and you've got the lower accrual in the 1995 scheme. This compensation scheme, which was this bit, will hopefully mean if HMRC can deliver this, they will have all the information that they need, i.e. what your earnings were in that 7-year period and everything from the scheme, including the new scheme figures for the 2015 scheme, and then they will allow you to process a refund for overpaid contributions or to amend the scheme pays elections. So at the moment, they're just scoping that as a piece of work to see if that's something that they can deliver. Because if they can't, that's something that an accountant or somebody else will have to deliver. And of course, that will mean that they will charge a not inconsiderable fee for that, I expect. And then the government ultimately will be liable for that, because you're only having to revisit those 7 tax years because of the government's age discrimination, which means that they will have to pay that bill, which is why they're looking at trying to do this themselves. And then only when you retire will you make that decision whether or not you want to stick with keeping that 7 years in the old scheme, or twist and by moving everything over to the 2015 scheme, including that 7-year period. And at the moment, as per the consultation on last Friday, you wouldn't have a higher AA charge by doing that, but there's this complication around partial retirement, whether or not they fix that glitch that we raised with them just before Christmas.
So you wouldn't have to pay the compensation back?
At the moment, not. But the way they've written the rules, potentially, you wouldn't have to pay it back in the year of retirement, but if you partially retired in the year after, you would potentially have to pay it back. But clearly no one will partially retire if that's the case, so they just have to fix that, if that's what it means.
Thank you very much. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for. There are loads of questions which we haven't been able to get to. But thank you very much for a fantastic talk. And Tony's also very kindly said that he will hang around at the end to pick up on any questions that have gone unanswered so far.